I'd driven for hours through winding forest roads, the towering pines of the Ozark National Forest casting jagged shadows across my windshield. By the time I reached the secluded campsite by the river, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in twilight. I killed the engine of my RV and stepped out, inhaling the damp, earthy scent of the woods. The stillness was unnerving. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I shook it off, telling myself this was exactly why I'd come here. I needed the quiet to think, to clear my head. Between the chaos of my job as a software engineer and the looming question of whether I was ready to propose to Rachel, my girlfriend of 4 years, I'd been spiraling. This trip was supposed to be my reset, a chance to disconnect from the noise and find some clarity. But as I set up my campsite, I noticed something strange, a flickering light, faint and distant near the riverbank. At first, I assumed it was another camper. Yet, as I watched, the light moved in a way that felt unnatural, almost like it was floating. Probably a firefly, I muttered, though I didn't believe it. I focused on unpacking and ignored the nagging feeling crawling up my spine. Later that night, I sat in the RV, recording a voice memo on my phone. It was something I'd started doing recently, a way to process my thoughts when I couldn't talk to Rachel. Day 1 in the Ozarks, I began. Quiet, almost too quiet. I saw this weird light by the river earlier. Not sure what it was. Anyway, I came out here to... My phone cut off mid-sentence. I frowned, glancing at the screen. The app had closed itself. When I reopened it, the recording was corrupted. Just static and faint whispers I couldn't make out. I deleted it and tried again, but my phone froze completely. Frustrated, I tossed it aside and decided to call it a night. I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I heard faint tapping against the side of the RV. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the taps were deliberate, rhythmic. I got up, heart pounding, and peered out the window. The flickering light was back, closer this time, hovering between the trees. I stared, frozen. It wasn't a flashlight. It wasn't a lantern. It wasn't anything I could explain. The tapping stopped, and the light disappeared into the woods. The next morning, I drove into town to grab some supplies and maybe shake off the unease from the night before. At the bait shop, an older man named Clyde rang me up. He had the kind of face that seemed carved from weathered stone, his eyes sharp beneath a weathered cap. "You're camping by the river, huh?" he asked as he bagged my things. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's nice out there, quiet." Clyde paused, his hand hovering over the register. "You see anything strange?" "Strange? Like what?" "Like a light," he said, lowering his voice. "A flicker by the trees. Most folks don't stay long once they see it." I felt a chill crawl up my neck. "I might have seen something," I admitted. "What's the deal with it?" Clyde leaned in, his voice a hushed whisper. "That's the Lantern Man. Used to be a ferryman way back when folks crossed the river by boat. Story goes, one night some travelers stiffed him on his fare. They fought, and the man threw him overboard. Lantern Man drowned. Now he lures people into the woods with his light. If you follow it, you don't come back." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like a great ghost story." Clyde didn't smile. "Don't follow the light," he said, "and whatever you do, don't go near the river at night." I drove back to the campsite, telling myself Clyde was just trying to spook me. But his words stuck in my head, echoing louder as the day wore on. That evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, the light returned. It was closer this time, just beyond the edge of the campsite. I could see it clearly now, a small, flickering orb, swaying gently as if held by an invisible hand. I tried to ignore it, retreating into the RV and locking the door. But the strange occurrences escalated. First, the lights inside the RV began to flicker, despite the generator running smoothly. Then, I noticed my belongings weren't where I'd left them. My journal, where I'd been jotting down my thoughts about Rachel and the trip, was open to a blank page. The edges of the paper were damp, as though someone had touched it with wet hands. The whispers started next, faint but unmistakable. They came from outside, calling my name in Rachel's voice. "Ethan," they said, "come out." My heart raced as I peeked through the window. The light was directly outside now, floating in the air like a phantom. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside. As soon as I exited the RV, the light began to retreat, moving deeper into the woods. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, and I felt an inexplicable urge to follow. I knew I shouldn't, but my feet moved on their own, the damp ground squelching beneath my boots. The light led me to the riverbank where an old, rotting ferry sat half submerged in the water. The wood was dark and splintered, moss clinging to its edges. The light hovered over the ferry, swaying as if waiting for me to board. The air grew thick, and I heard the sound of rushing water, though the river itself was calm. Then came the screams, panicked and desperate, like someone drowning. My chest tightened as the light began to shift, stretching and morphing until it became a figure. The Lantern Man. He was tall and shadowy, his form flickering like smoke. His face was indistinct, but I could see the lantern he carried, its glow casting eerie patterns on the trees. When he spoke, his voice was a distorted rasp, like wind through broken glass. "You're just like him," he said, "the traveler who betrayed me. Selfish, cowardly, ungrateful." "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, stepping back. But the Lantern Man moved closer, his hollow eyes boring into me. "You doubt," he hissed, "your work, your love, your life. You take and take, but you give nothing back." Visions flooded my mind. Rachel's tearful face as I avoided her questions about marriage, the emails from my boss I'd ignored, the promises I'd made and broken. The Lantern Man was feeding on my guilt, twisting it into a noose around my neck. "You can stay," he said, holding out the lantern. "Take my place, and I'll let you go." I shook my head, backing away. "No." "Then you'll carry your guilt forever." Desperate, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the lantern from his hands and hurled it into the river. The water erupted in a deafening roar, the lantern sinking beneath the surface as the Lantern Man screamed. The light flickered and died, and the shadowy figure dissolved into mist. I stumbled back to the RV as dawn broke, my legs trembling with each step. The woods were silent again, the air still and cold. But the feeling of being watched never left. I left the campsite that morning, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I told myself it was over, that I'd escaped. But as I drove down the winding road, my radio flickered on. Through the static, I heard the Lantern Man's voice, faint but clear. "You'll be back." The RV groaned to a halt in front of the ruins of a service station, its rusted pumps leaning like forgotten sentinels. I killed the engine and let the quiet wrap around me. It wasn't just silence, it was absence. No birds, no wind, no hum of distant cars. Just the stillness of the forest, dense and impenetrable. Perfect, I thought. Exactly what I needed. I'd spent the past 5 years turning my true crime obsession into a modestly successful podcast called Vanishing Roads. Every season, I dove into unsolved disappearances and the eerie places tied to them. This trip was meant to kick off the latest season, inspired by a listener's email about Hollow Pike, a road outside Mount Rainier National Park that allegedly caused travelers to vanish. I hadn't planned to come here, but something about the story stuck in my head, an itch I couldn't ignore. The legend was simple enough. Hollow Pike wasn't on any official maps, but locals claimed it appeared to those who sought it. Those who followed the road, they were never seen again. I set up camp next to the ruins, recording my opening monologue into the podcast mic. Listeners, welcome to Vanishing Roads. I'm Caleb Reed, and today we're diving into the mystery of Hollow Pike, a road that may not exist but has claimed dozens of lives. I paused, glancing at my notebook where I'd scrawled the tip that led me here. The road doesn't want to be found, and if you find it, don't follow it. I chuckled nervously into the mic. Well, I guess I'll test that theory. The sun had barely set when the first strange thing happened. I'd just finished dinner and was tidying up when I heard it. The low hum of an engine, distant but growing closer. My heart raced. I stepped out of the RV, expecting to see headlights cutting through the fog, but there was nothing. The hum stopped abruptly, like a switch had been flipped. I shook my head, trying to shrug off the unease, but my eyes caught something in the dirt. Tire tracks, fresh and deep, leading into the forest. It didn't make sense. I'd been here for hours. No car could have gotten in without me noticing. Back inside, I tried to record my thoughts, but my equipment had other ideas. The mic hissed with static, and my recorder glitched, distorting my voice into an eerie, guttural echo. I checked the batteries. They were fresh. That night, I dreamed of a road, long and endless, its edges blurred by mist. I was driving, but I didn't know where. The headlights illuminated nothing but asphalt stretching infinitely ahead. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as a voice whispered my name, faint at first, then louder. "Caleb! Caleb!" I woke with a start. My keys, which I'd left on the counter, were sitting on the driver's seat. The next morning, I found the road, or rather it found me. It wasn't there the day before, I was certain of it, but now a pristine asphalt path stretched into the forest, its surface glistening as though freshly rained on. My breath caught. I recorded as I approached. Listeners, it seems the stories were true. The road is here, but where it leads is anyone's guess. As I stepped onto the pavement, the air seemed to change. The silence deepened, pressing in around me, and the forest darkened as though the sunlight was being swallowed. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back louder than it should have. A mile in, I noticed the abandoned vehicles. Rusted husks of old cars sat half buried along the road's edges, their windows shattered and frames twisted. One had its door open, and inside, a child's toy sat on the passenger seat, a stuffed bear with one missing eye. I pulled out my mic. These vehicles look like they've been here for decades, but how? There's no way this road could support cars. It's surrounded by dense forest. A signpost loomed ahead, its paint peeling. It read, "No exit." The air felt heavier with every step, and the sounds began, soft at first, like a distant radio playing just out of range. Then came the honk of a car horn, loud and jarring, followed by the faint echo of a woman screaming. I froze. I don't know how long I stood there before I saw her. She appeared in the distance, a woman in a long coat, her outline blurred by the fog. She waved at me, her movements slow and deliberate. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. Are you okay?" She didn't respond. I moved closer, my feet dragging like the asphalt was pulling me down. Her face became clearer, and my stomach churned. Her features weren't human. They were wrong. Her eyes were dark hollows, her mouth stretched too wide, her skin cracked like old wood. She whispered something I couldn't understand, then vanished. By the time I reached the road's end, I was shaken. A rusted car sat parked across the asphalt, its tires melted into the ground. Inside, a skeleton slumped against the steering wheel, its bony fingers clutching a tape recorder. I pressed play. A man's voice crackled to life. "The road shows you what you've lost and makes you pay for it." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Around me, the air rippled and the road seemed to warp. The asphalt cracked, revealing glimpses of the forest floor below, and shadows shifted in the fog. Visions assaulted me. I saw my ex-wife, her face twisted in anger as she screamed at me for prioritizing my work over our marriage. I saw the tear-streaked face of a source I'd failed to protect, her story twisted in the press until she took her own life. Every regret, every failure, played out before me, vivid and merciless. The shadows closed in, and I knew I couldn't stay. I ran. The road twisted and looped, bending back on itself no matter how far I went. The woman appeared again, her hollow eyes boring into me. "It's too late for you now," she whispered. Desperation clawed at me. I reached into my pack and pulled out the notebook I'd carried everywhere, a collection of stories and sketches my father had given me before he passed. It was the only thing I couldn't bear to lose. Tears blurred my vision as I hurled it into the shadows. "Take it. Just let me go." The whispers stopped. The shadows receded. The road dissolved into fog, and I found myself back at the service station. I didn't wait. I threw my gear into the RV and sped away, my heart pounding as the trees blurred past. When I reached the highway, the world felt normal again, but I didn't feel safe. Weeks later, I edited the episode. The audio was distorted, the static bleeding into the recording like a living thing, but I uploaded it anyway. It went viral, drawing listeners eager to find Hollow Pike for themselves. And now I'm haunted by what I've done. A month after the upload, an email arrived with no sender address. It read, "You brought them to the road. The road remembers." And last night, I heard it again, the faint hum of an engine idling outside my window. The first thing you notice about Red Rock Pass is the silence. Not the kind of quiet that soothes you, but the kind that crawls under your skin. It was unnerving, even for me. I'd parked my RV at the edge of the canyon, just as the sun dipped below the sandstone cliffs, staining the sky blood red. The wind howled faintly through the rocks, but otherwise nothing moved. Perfect for a ghost story, I thought. I'd come here to uncover the truth behind the disappearances. Campers and hikers who had ventured into these canyons and never come back. The locals talked about something called the echo, a supernatural phenomenon, voices calling out to people, leading them astray. I didn't believe any of it, of course, but it made for a good story. And after years of chasing hard news, I'd settled into a more lucrative, if less serious, career as a travel blogger. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Red Rock Pass was wrong. The next morning, I set out early to hike the main trail. The canyon walls loomed over me, their surfaces etched with layers of ancient history. I took my time filming the red sandstone formations, narrating the eerie legends for my audience. Locals say the echo calls to you with voices of those you know, or your own voice. If you follow it, you vanish, leaving nothing but a faint impression behind. I chuckled into the camera. Let's hope I don't hear myself out here. I spent hours exploring, but something felt off. Trails that were supposed to be straightforward seemed to twist back on themselves. My GPS occasionally glitched, the arrow spinning wildly before settling on a direction that didn't make sense. Then there was the first voice. "Ethan!" I froze, spinning around. The canyon was empty. "Ethan, help me!" It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. My own voice. I told myself it was the wind, just an illusion of sound bouncing off the canyon walls, but my gut churned as I continued walking. By midday, I met someone else. A woman hunched over a small piece of seismic equipment near a rock outcrop. "Hey," I called out, approaching. She stood and turned, looking annoyed at first, then curious. "You lost?" "No, just exploring. Ethan Grayson." I held out my hand. "Rachel Ortiz," she said, shaking it briefly. "I'm a geologist. I'm here studying some strange magnetic anomalies in the area." "That sounds convenient," I said, half joking. She smirked. "You must be the blogger the park office mentioned. You're here for the ghost stories." "Guilty." Rachel rolled her eyes. "Well, I don't believe in ghosts, but there is something weird about this place. My instruments keep malfunctioning. It's like the ground is constantly shifting." I raised an eyebrow. "You think that could explain the disappearances?" She shrugged. "I think people get lost, fall, or wander too far. It's a dangerous area." That night, back at the RV, the real strangeness began. I'd just finished reviewing my footage when I heard it again. My voice calling from the canyon. This time, it was clearer, closer. "Ethan, help!" Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, but the canyon was quiet and empty. I walked to the edge of the trail, peering down into the black void. "Ethan!" The voice echoed again, this time from behind me. I spun around, heart racing. No one was there. When I checked my watch, an hour had passed, though it felt like only minutes. The next morning, I found Rachel near the trailhead. "I need to show you something," I said, holding out my camera. The footage I'd taken the night before was normal at first. Dark shots of the canyon, me whispering into the mic about hearing the voices. But as I played it back for Rachel, we heard something new. "Turn back, Ethan." It wasn't my voice this time. It was deep, guttural, and chilling. Rachel frowned. "Did you add that?" "No," I said. "I don't even know what it is." Her skepticism faltered. "I've been getting weird readings from the west side of the canyon. There's a spot where the magnetic interference is strongest. It might be worth checking out." We hiked for hours, following Rachel's instruments. The canyon seemed to close in on us the deeper we went, the sandstone walls narrowing until the sky was a thin strip of light above. I started noticing strange carvings on the rocks, circles, lines, and symbols that resembled a map. "Ever seen anything like this?" I asked. Rachel shook her head. "Not in this area. These don't look like typical petroglyphs." We pressed on until we found it, a massive circular carving etched into the rock wall. It was at least 10 feet wide, with intricate patterns spiraling toward the center. Rachel's equipment started beeping wildly. "This is it," she said. "The interference is strongest here." I reached out to touch the carving, but Rachel grabbed my arm. "Don't," she said sharply. "Why not?" She hesitated. "I don't know, but something about this place feels wrong." As the sun set, the whispers began again. "Ethan," Rachel froze. "Did you hear that?" "I've been hearing it for days," I said, my voice tight. "Help me, Ethan." The voice echoed around us, bouncing off the canyon walls. Then we saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, faint and flickering like mirages. A man in a tattered jacket, a woman clutching a backpack. Their faces were blurred, as if smeared by time. Rachel stepped back, her breath hitching. "What are they?" I shook my head, unable to speak. The figures surrounded us, their mouths moving, but the whispers came from everywhere. One of them reached out to me, its hand stretched impossibly long. "Don't touch it," Rachel shouted, pulling me back. We ran, but the canyon seemed to twist around us. Trails we'd followed earlier were gone, replaced by new ones that looped endlessly. The sun disappeared, plunging us into twilight far too early. "We're trapped," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "No," I said, gripping her arm. "The carving. It's the center of this thing. We have to go back." She hesitated but nodded. When we returned to the carving, the figures were waiting. They stood motionless, their blurred faces turned toward us. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices overlapping and repeating my name. Rachel's equipment sparked, and she dropped it with a curse. "I can't get a reading anymore. Whatever this is, it's too strong." I stared at the carving, the patterns almost hypnotic. A thought occurred to me, a horrifying realization. "They're echoes," I said. "What?" Rachel asked. "The people who vanished. They didn't disappear. They're stuck here between dimensions or something. The canyon is holding them." Rachel shook her head. "That's insane." "Look at them," I said, pointing to the figures. "That's what's left of them." The echo grew louder, the air vibrating with its force. The figures began to close in, their movements jerky and unnatural. Desperate, I grabbed a rock and smashed it into the carving, chipping away at the patterns. "What are you doing?" Rachel screamed. "Breaking the connection," I shouted. The ground trembled, and the figures let out a collective wail, their forms flickering violently. I struck the carving again, and the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. The figures dissolved into the air, and the canyon went still. We stumbled back to camp in silence, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. As I packed my things, Rachel approached me. "You're not going to post about this, are you?" she asked. I shook my head. "Some stories shouldn't be told." She nodded, then walked away, her silhouette fading into the canyon's shadow. Weeks later, I found an old, weathered notebook in my RV. It wasn't mine, but my name was scrawled on the cover. Inside were notes, entries describing everything I'd just experienced, but in a handwriting I didn't recognize. On the last page was a single sentence: "Don't come back." The first thing I noticed about Ironwood State Park was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that blankets a forest, but a heavy, stifling quiet, like the air was holding its breath. My RV creaked and groaned as I maneuvered it into the campground, the only sound breaking the stillness. I was completely alone. That was the idea. After the mess of my divorce and a decade spent rubber stamping corporate projects that decimated forests like this one, I needed time to think. My boss thought this was me recharging. Truthfully, I wasn't sure why I came here. Maybe to convince myself I wasn't as complicit as I felt. I stepped out of the RV, breathing in the earthy scent of the forest. The ironwood trees loomed around me, their dark, twisted branches forming an oppressive canopy. Beautiful, sure, but there was something wrong about them, like they were watching. "Get it together," I muttered, grabbing my gear. As I was unloading my firewood, I heard someone clear their throat. Startled, I turned to see an older man in a faded green uniform standing near the tree line. His face was lined, his hands calloused, and he wore a hat emblazoned with the park's logo. "You must be Greg," he said, his voice gruff. "Joe Lasky, caretaker." "Didn't think there'd be anyone else out here," I replied. "There isn't," he said, his gaze drifting toward the ironwoods. "Not for long, anyway." "What do you mean?" Joe hesitated, then said, "This place doesn't like being disturbed. Best to stick to the marked trails, leave things as you find them." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, brushing off his tone. I wasn't here to let some cryptic caretaker scare me. But as Joe walked away, his parting words hung in the air. "Respect the forest, and it might let you leave." That night, as I sat by the fire, the quiet pressed in again. I tried to lose myself in a book, but every few minutes, I thought I heard something. Whispers? Wind? I glanced at the trees, their branches shifting ever so slightly, though there wasn't a breeze. "Paranoia," I muttered, tossing another log onto the fire. It wasn't until I went inside the RV that things really started to feel strange. The lights flickered as I turned them on, and the radio crackled to life, spewing static even though I hadn't touched it. Then came the scratches. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the RV's side, then louder, more deliberate, like claws dragging across the metal. I grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, shining the beam into the dark. Nothing. Just the ironwoods standing silent and still. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. But sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, the nightmares began. In the dream, I was running through the forest. The trees moved, their roots twisting up to block my path. Whispers surrounded me, growing louder until they became a roar. And then I tripped. As I hit the ground, the roots wrapped around my arms, dragging me downward. I woke with a start, gasping for breath. My hands were covered in dirt, and my boots were caked in mud. I hadn't left the RV, had I? The next morning, I found strange carvings on the trees near my campsite. Circles, jagged lines, runes, maybe? They hadn't been there the day before. I thought about asking Joe, but decided against it. He'd probably just give me another cryptic warning. That afternoon, I went for a hike. The marked trail was narrow, winding through the ironwoods like a thread through a needle. I kept my footsteps light, half hearing Joe's voice in my head, "Respect the forest." But as I reached a clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. An abandoned cabin. It was weathered and sun-bleached, its roof sagging under the weight of decades. Against my better judgment, I pushed open the door. The interior smelled of damp wood and decay. A table sat in the center, cluttered with broken tools and scraps of paper. One of them caught my eye, a journal. Its pages were brittle, the handwriting uneven and frantic. The forest knows, it feels, it punishes. Those who harm it become part of it. I set the journal down, my hands trembling. That's when I noticed the axe. It leaned against the far wall, its blade rusted and specked with what looked like dried blood. Next to it was a carving in the wall, deep and deliberate. "Leave before it's too late." I stumbled out of the cabin, heart pounding, and nearly ran straight into Joe. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "What is this place?" I demanded. "Who wrote that journal?" Joe didn't answer. Instead, he said, "The forest doesn't forget. You've taken things, haven't you? Firewood? A rock, maybe? Even a single leaf?" I blinked at him. I burned some firewood, yeah. What does that have to do with anything?" His expression hardened. "That's enough. The ironwood doesn't like thieves." "Thieves? It's dead wood." "To you, maybe," Joe said, "but not to it." That night, the spirit came. It started with the whispers, louder than ever, carrying my name through the trees. Then the RV lights flickered and went out completely. I grabbed my flashlight, but its beam barely cut through the dark. The scratching started again, more insistent this time. I stepped outside, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The forest was alive. The trees shifted, their branches stretching toward me, their roots writhing like snakes. And then I saw it. A shadow moved between the trees, formless and vast. Its outline flickered, shifting like smoke, but its eyes, two pinpoints of pale green light, locked on to me. "Greg," it whispered, a dozen voices layered into one, "you've taken, now give back." I stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The flashlight fell from my hand, the beam pointing upward. In its dim glow, I saw the branches above me twisting into clawed shapes. "No!" I shouted. "I'll leave. I'll leave everything behind." The spirit didn't answer. Instead, the forest closed in. I don't know how I got back inside the RV. My memory was a blur of running, screaming, and the whispers growing louder until they filled my skull. When I finally slammed the door shut, the lights flickered back on. The scratches stopped. The whispers faded. But I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, I went straight to Joe's cabin. He stood on the porch as if he'd been expecting me. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. "What does it want?" "It wants what you took," Joe said, "and it wants you to remember." I told him about the journal, the carvings, the axe. He nodded grimly. "You're not the first. People come here, take what isn't theirs, and the forest takes them in return. It doesn't want your firewood, Greg. It wants your guilt." That night, I made my peace. I gathered everything I'd taken from the forest, every scrap of wood, every stone I'd idly pocketed, and left it at the base of an ironwood tree. Then I spoke aloud, apologizing for the harm I'd done, for all the forests I'd destroyed in my corporate life. for seeing nature as a resource instead of something alive. The forest went still, and then the whispers returned, softer this time. A single word echoed through the trees. Remember. I left Ironwood State Park the next morning. The scratches on the RV had vanished, the lights worked perfectly. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit was still watching. Months later, a package arrived at my office. Inside was a piece of ironwood bark, carved with the same runes I'd seen in the forest, and beneath it, a single word, remember. I should have known better than to trust a name like Devil's Hollow, but the Black Hills had been calling me for weeks, an itch in my mind that no amount of rational thought could scratch. When I stumbled on Devil's Hollow campground while browsing for remote places to visit, it felt like fate. My RV rattled down the narrow dirt road leading to the campsite, every bump threatening to loosen its aging frame. The forest on either side was dense, the kind of place where light came to die. When I finally emerged into the clearing, I found myself alone. A few rotten picnic tables dotted the campground, and to one side, a rusted RV leaned precariously, vines wrapping around its chassis like nature had claimed it. Perfect, I muttered, parking and stepping outside. The air was heavy, carrying the earthy scent of decay. I told myself it was just a deserted campground, but the silence was wrong. Not the peaceful kind, but the sort that made you hyper-aware of every breath you took. As I set up camp, a voice startled me. "Didn't expect anyone else out here," a woman called. I turned to see a tall, athletic woman in a ranger's uniform stepping into the clearing. Her brown hair was pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail, and her eyes were sharp, scanning me like she was sizing me up. "Ella Dawson," she introduced herself. "Sam Calloway," I said, shaking her hand. "Didn't think rangers worked places this remote." "We don't. Not usually, but Devil's Hollow has a reputation." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of reputation?" Ella hesitated, crossing her arms. "People disappear out here sometimes. Locals say the forest is cursed. Personally, I think it's bad luck and bad decisions, but I still wouldn't recommend staying long." I laughed nervously. "Well, I'm here to investigate those stories for my channel. The whole disappearing campers thing is great for views." Her jaw tightened. "Just don't get lost trying to make a name for yourself." With that, she turned and walked back into the woods, leaving me with the kind of unease I couldn't shake. That night, the first weird thing happened. I was filming an intro for my video by the fire pit, the orange flames casting flickering shadows on the trees behind me. The footage seemed fine as I reviewed it on the camera's tiny screen, but then I heard it. Voices. Faint at first, but unmistakable. "Help us," one whispered. "Please don't leave us here," said another, more urgent. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing but shadows, though the beam flickered slightly, as if struggling to pierce the dark. When I played the footage back again, the voices were clearer this time. "Sam?" one whispered, my name dragged out unnaturally. I shut the camera off and stared into the woods. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. The forest was dead silent again, and I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I found the trail by accident. I was wandering through the woods, looking for a good spot to film a segment about Devil's Hollow's history, when I noticed strange carvings on the trees. They were crude but deliberate. Circles, jagged lines, shapes that reminded me of wagon wheels. I followed them deeper into the forest until I stumbled on what could only be described as an ancient campsite. Rotting wooden wagons leaned against trees, their wheels shattered. Broken tools littered the ground, and a fire pit lay cold and overgrown. But it was the journal that caught my attention. It was tucked under a pile of rocks, the leather cover cracked and weathered. The handwriting inside was uneven, growing more frantic with each entry. We are lost. The hollow twists upon itself. Time is no longer our own. We hear them calling, but they are not us. The wagon master says we must stay together, but I don't trust him. This place, it hungers. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The air around me was colder now, the silence pressing against my ears like a weight. Then I heard the whispers again. "Sam?" I turned to see a figure at the edge of the clearing, a woman in a tattered dress, her hair falling in uneven strands over hollow eyes. Her head tilted unnaturally, as if she were studying me. Then she vanished. Ella found me back at the campsite, pacing nervously as I replayed the footage I'd taken. She frowned when I told her what I'd seen. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "I'm not leaving," I shot back. "There's something out here, and I'm going to figure out what it is." Her expression hardened. "You don't understand. This place doesn't let people go. Once it notices you, you're part of it." "What does that even mean?" Ella hesitated, then said, "The disappearances, they don't make sense. Time doesn't work right here. People leave camp, think they've been gone an hour, and show up days later. Or they don't show up at all. The ones we do find, they are not the same." Before I could respond, the sky darkened suddenly, like a storm rolling in out of nowhere. Ella's hand went to the gun on her hip as she scanned the tree line. "They're here," she said, her voice low. That night, the time loop began. I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on the RV door. When I opened it, Ella was standing there, panic etched across her face. "You need to come with me," she said. I grabbed my flashlight and followed her into the woods, but the trail seemed wrong. The trees bent inward, their branches twisting like claws. Every step felt like walking in circles, and the forest grew darker with each passing second. "We're not going to make it," Ella said suddenly, her voice distant. "What are you talking about?" She turned to face me, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were hollow now, her face stretched and distorted. I stumbled back, and when I blinked, she was gone. I woke up in my RV, gasping for breath. The clock read 10:07 p.m., the same as when I'd first heard the knock. The sequence repeated. Ella knocking, leading me into the woods, the hollow-eyed version of her appearing, and then nothingness. Again and again, the loop played out, each time more vivid and horrifying. By the fifth time, I realized the whispers were growing louder. "They're getting closer," Ella's voice said, though I didn't know if it was really her or the forest twisting her words. In the final loop, I found the journal again, though I hadn't brought it back from the campsite. It was open to a page I hadn't seen before. The wagon master had a brass compass. He said it would guide us home, but it was a lie. He buried it to keep us here, to keep us lost. We are hollow now, so hollow. I didn't understand what it meant until Ella appeared. This time, the real her, bloodied and wild-eyed. "The compass," she said, grabbing my arm. "It's the key. We have to destroy it." We ran to the pioneer campsite, the forest warping around us as the shadows closed in. The forgotten ones emerged from the trees, gaunt, hollow-eyed figures in tattered clothes. Their mouths opened in silent screams as they moved toward us, flickering like old film. Ella dug frantically at the ground while I shone my flashlight at the spirits, hoping to slow them down. The beam flickered, barely holding the darkness at bay. "I've got it!" Ella shouted, pulling a tarnished brass compass from the soil. The spirits shrieked, their forms twisting violently as they surged toward us. "Break it!" I yelled. Ella swung her axe, shattering the compass in one blow. The forest erupted in a blinding light, and the spirits dissolved into ash. When we stumbled back to camp, the forest was quiet again. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by the ordinary sounds of wind and rustling leaves. "Is it over?" I asked. Ella nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "For now." Weeks later, back home, I reviewed the footage on my camera. One clip made my blood freeze. A shot of me wandering through the forest alone, calling Ella's name. In the background, the hollow-eyed spirits watched silently, waiting. And when I glanced at my reflection in the RV window, for just a moment, my eyes looked hollow too. They called it the Blackwater howler. Locals swore it roamed the dense forests of Monongahela National Forest, a shadowy beast with glowing red eyes and a howl that could freeze your blood. The stories didn't faze me. Cryptid tales were always the same. Bear sightings exaggerated, wildcat calls mistaken for something more sinister. My job was to separate fact from fiction, and I'd done it dozens of times before. Still, as I parked my RV at the edge of Blackwater Ridge, the forest seemed off. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. Birds called faintly from somewhere in the canopy, but the woods themselves felt unnaturally still, as if the trees were holding their breath. This was going to be my next big story. The legend of the Blackwater howler debunked. If I could photograph whatever people were mistaking for a monster, a bear, a cougar, maybe even an owl, it'd be a win for me and my career. I'd already envisioned the title trending online. At the general store just outside the forest, I'd met Milo, a wiry old man with sun-leathered skin and a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. When I told him I was headed up Blackwater Ridge, he gave me a look that lingered too long. "Don't stay out after dark," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, as if the words carried weight. "The howler hunts those who mock it." I laughed it off, but Milo didn't smile. He just spat into the dirt and turned away, muttering something under his breath. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked along the ridge, setting up motion-triggered cameras and taking photos of claw marks on the trees. They were high, too high for a normal predator. I brushed it off as an overzealous black bear. That night, back in the RV, I reviewed the footage. Static. Every single camera showed distorted images, as if something had interfered with the signals. Frustrated, I turned on my audio recorder. I'd left it running all afternoon, hoping to catch ambient forest sounds. Instead, I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, long and drawn out, rising into an ear-piercing howl that made my skin crawl. My rational mind tried to place it, maybe a coyote or a distant wolf, but the sound didn't match anything I'd heard before. It was deeper, more primal, and it didn't sound distant. It sounded close. I didn't sleep well that night. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of rustling outside the RV. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The next morning, I ventured farther up the ridge. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual rustle of small animals and birds absent. As I followed a faint trail, I came across something that made my stomach turn. An abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters. The ground was littered with torn clothing, a broken stove, and scattered gear. Claw marks gouged the nearby trees, deep and deliberate. Among the debris, I found a journal. The entries were frantic, written in shaky handwriting. "It's watching me, circling the camp. It won't let me leave." The final entry was a scrawled plea, "Help me." By late afternoon, I'd set up more cameras and started back toward the RV. That's when I found the tracks. They were massive, larger than any bear print I'd ever seen, with deep claw marks in the soil. The stride was unnaturally long, and the tracks seemed to vanish into thin air, as if whatever made them had leapt into the trees. The howls started again that evening. At first, they were distant, echoing through the forest like a warning, but as the sun set, they grew closer, circling my camp. I stayed inside the RV, my camera ready, hoping for a glimpse of the creature. When I saw it, I wished I hadn't. Two glowing red eyes stared at me from the darkness, unblinking. They hovered at a height far too tall for any known predator, swaying slightly as if the creature were studying me. I fumbled for my camera, snapping a photo just as the eyes disappeared. The night was restless. Something slammed against the RV, shaking it violently. I clutched my flashlight, breathing hard as clawed shadows moved across the windows. The whispers started soon after. Faint at first, they sounded like someone calling my name. "Rick!" My blood turned cold. The voice sounded like Milo's. "Rick, help me." I gritted my teeth, refusing to open the door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they faded into the night. At dawn, I reviewed my footage. The photos were blurry, the creature's form obscured by darkness and motion. Frustrated, I decided to set a trap. If the howler wanted to play games, I'd play too. I baited an area near the ridge with scraps of meat and set up cameras around the perimeter. Then I waited, hidden among the trees with my telephoto lens trained on the sight. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Hours passed, and just when I thought nothing would happen, I heard it. A low growl, followed by heavy footsteps. The howler emerged from the shadows, its massive form barely visible through the trees. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could recognize. It moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs elongated, its body cloaked in shadow. The red eyes burned like embers, scanning the area before it approached the bait. I snapped photo after photo, my hands shaking. Then it stopped. It turned its head, those glowing eyes locking on to me. My breath caught as the creature let out a deafening roar, charging toward me with terrifying speed. I bolted back to the RV, the howler crashing through the underbrush behind me. It hit the vehicle like a freight train, rocking it on its wheels. Inside, I grabbed my flare gun, heart pounding. When the creature circled back, I fired a flare directly at it. The howler reared back, its form flickering like a shadow caught in the light. It let out a guttural scream, retreating into the darkness. That's when I heard Milo's voice again. "It can't be killed," he said. It's part of this place. Leave while you still can." I didn't wait for morning. I packed my gear and left Blackwater Ridge, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow road. The howler's eyes haunted me, lingering in my rearview mirror long after the forest had disappeared from sight. When I reviewed the footage later, the photos were as inconclusive as ever. Blurry shapes, red eyes, shadows that didn't make sense. But I knew what I saw, and I knew I wouldn't be going back. The Blackwater howler wasn't just a story. It was real, and some legends are better left alone. I arrived at Grand Staircase Escalante late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the sandstone cliffs. It was the perfect spot, remote, rugged, and untouched. My RV felt out of place against the stark beauty of the landscape, a reminder of the modern world in a place that seemed to exist outside of time. I'd come here to study the unique geological formations for a paper I was writing. I told myself this trip was for work, but in truth, I needed a break from the sterile monotony of academia. Field work had always been my escape, a way to lose myself in the simplicity of rocks and sediment. Out here, I could focus on something tangible, something that didn't talk back or demand answers. The slot canyon near my campsite caught my attention immediately. Narrow and twisting, its walls rose high above me, carved smooth by centuries of wind and water. The acoustics were incredible. Every sound echoed back like a living thing. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, listening to my own breath bounce off the walls. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. I decided to explore it the next day. The canyon was even more impressive up close. The sunlight barely reached the bottom, casting the walls in an otherworldly glow. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the canyon itself were mimicking me. I paused to take notes and noticed something odd. Scratches etched into the sandstone. At first, they seemed random, just wear and tear from the elements, but the deeper I went, the more deliberate they became. Spirals, lines, shapes that looked disturbingly like eyes. I took a photo, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My drone was supposed to map the canyon, its LiDAR scanner capturing detailed 3D images. I launched it, watching on my tablet as it flew ahead, weaving through the narrow passageways. The footage was perfect until it wasn't. Static overtook the screen, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, an elongated shadow moving along the canyon wall. "Just a glitch," I muttered, but my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. The drone returned safely, but the footage was corrupted, the shadow gone. I brushed it off, attributing it to interference from the canyon walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs that I assumed were the wind. But as I lay in my RV, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. Voices calling my name. "Dan! Dan! Help me!" I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The whispers were coming from outside, circling the RV. I peeked through the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the darkness was impenetrable. The voices grew more insistent, pleading until they faded as suddenly as they had begun. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I returned to the canyon, determined to figure out what was going on. The markings had multiplied. New shapes covered the walls, crude figures surrounded by jagged lines like something clawing its way out of the stone. The air felt heavier, the silence oppressive. Even the echoes seemed wrong, bouncing back distorted and mocking. Deeper in the canyon, I found the petroglyphs, ancient carvings depicting figures locked in some kind of struggle. One showed a group of people huddled together, their faces twisted in fear. Around them were dark, shapeless forms merging with the stone itself. The final carving was the most disturbing. A lone figure trapped within the rock, its mouth open in a silent scream. I didn't linger. That night, the whispers came again, louder and more personal. "Why didn't you help me?" one voice said, eerily familiar. My stomach twisted. It sounded like my sister, Amy. She'd died when we were kids, a drowning accident during a family camping trip. I'd always blamed myself for not reaching her in time. "I needed you," the voice continued, accusatory and raw. Another voice joined in, this one my own. "You're a coward, Dan, always running away." The whispers grew into a cacophony, overlapping and suffocating. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The RV seemed to vibrate with the noise. Desperate, I stumbled outside, hoping the open air would clear my head. That's when I saw it. My shadow moved, separately from me. It twisted and stretched along the canyon wall, growing taller, its edges warping into unnatural shapes. My heart raced as I backed away, but the shadow followed, crawling along the rock like a living thing. Then it stopped, forming a jagged, humanoid shape with burning eyes that stared straight at me. I ran. The canyon had changed. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by narrow passageways that twisted endlessly. The walls seemed to close in, their surfaces undulating as if alive. My flashlight flickered, and in the weak beam, I saw the markings on the walls moving, rearranging themselves into new shapes. And then I saw it. The shadow in the rock. It emerged from the sandstone like a living sculpture, its body dark and featureless, blending seamlessly with the canyon walls. It moved without sound, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I froze, paralyzed by a wave of dread so intense it felt physical. The whispers returned, pouring from the walls, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. The creature didn't attack, but its presence was suffocating. It didn't need to touch me to make me feel trapped, its gaze pinning me in place. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I shone the beam on it, the creature flinched, its form flickering like a shadow caught in a gust of wind. I ran again, deeper into the canyon, hoping to lose it. The markings on the walls led me to a clearing, a small chamber where the walls formed a natural dome. At its center was an altar, crude and ancient, surrounded by weathered talismans and bones. The carvings here were different, more chaotic, as if whoever made them had been in a frenzy. I heard the whispers again, louder this time, coming from the walls, the floor, the air itself. The shadow appeared at the edge of the chamber, moving closer, its form expanding, filling the space. Desperation took over. I grabbed one of the talismans, a stick bound with sinew, and threw it at the altar. The whispers surged, and the shadow hesitated, its form flickering again. My flashlight's battery was dying, but I aimed it at the altar and turned it on, the light illuminating the markings. The creature screamed. It wasn't a sound, it was a vibration, a wave of terror that threatened to break me. But the light worked. The carvings on the altar seemed to absorb the energy, glowing faintly, and the shadow began to retreat, its form dissolving back into the rock. I stumbled out of the canyon at dawn, my legs weak, my mind racing. The landscape looked normal again, the twisted passageways and shifting walls gone. My RV was where I'd left it, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. When I reviewed the drone footage later, the images were distorted, the shadows on the canyon walls moving independently. The petroglyphs were gone, replaced by smooth sandstone, but the memory of them burned in my mind. I left Grand Staircase Escalante that day, vowing never to return. But as I drove away, I caught a glimpse of my shadow in the rearview mirror. It moved, just slightly, out of sync with my own. The canyon had let me go, but a part of it had followed. I've always been drawn to the places that feel like the edge of the world. Olympic National Park was one of those places, its misty forests and rugged terrain unlike anything I'd ever seen. The Ho Rainforest, they called it, an otherworldly expanse of moss-covered trees and dense fog. Perfect for the kind of photography that my followers ate up. Moody, ethereal shots, the kind that made you want to disappear into the wild. When I rolled into a gas station just outside the park, the man behind the counter eyed me warily. I'd asked him for tips on where to camp, and he'd told me to stick to the main sites. But if you go into the forest, he added, leaning closer, don't stay out when the fog comes. It watches. I laughed it off. Local superstition, I figured. A story to keep people from wandering too far off the beaten path. I thanked him, bought some supplies, and drove on. I didn't think about his words again until much later. The first day in the rainforest was incredible. I parked my RV in a secluded clearing, the only sounds the distant trickle of water and the occasional chirp of birds. This was what I'd been craving. Silence, space, a break from the noise of city life and the pressure of trying to turn my travels into a profitable venture. Out here, it was just me, my camera, and the forest. The fog came in that evening, rolling in slowly like a living thing. It clung to the ground, weaving between the trees, and I couldn't resist capturing it. I launched my drone, sending it high above the canopy, and watched through my monitor as the mist swallowed everything. The footage was perfect until the drone's feed started glitching. Static flickered across the screen, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing in the fog. But when I brought the drone back down and reviewed the footage, there was nothing there. Just trees and mist. The unease crept in, subtle at first. I brushed it off and went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching me. The second day, the fog didn't lift. It hung low and thick, muffling sound and distorting shapes. I ventured deeper into the woods, determined to find a better vantage point for photos. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the trees. Then I started noticing the markings. At first, they seemed like scratches, carved into the bark of trees along the trail. But as I went farther, they became more deliberate. Spirals, lines that resembled an eye. I took photos of them, though they made my skin crawl. Something about the symbols felt wrong, like they didn't belong. I heard the footsteps not long after. At first, I thought it was an echo of my own, but they didn't match my pace. They were slower, deliberate, coming from somewhere just behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering, but the trail was empty. The fog thickened, swallowing the trees, and I turned back toward the RV. The way back took longer than I remembered. The trail seemed to shift, twisting on itself, and I swore I was walking in circles. The fog pressed closer, wrapping around me like a damp shroud, and the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the crunch of my boots, but as I walked, they grew louder. Voices, indistinct but familiar, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. I stopped, straining to hear, and the whispers became laughter. It was soft and mocking, like someone was just out of sight, watching me struggle. I broke into a run. By the time I reached the RV, it was nearly dark. The fog had followed me, clinging to the vehicle like a second skin. I locked the doors, my hands trembling, and tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Exhaustion, maybe. The isolation getting to me. But when I stepped outside to catch my breath, the whispers came back. This time they weren't faint. They were loud, clear, and unmistakable, voices from my past. My ex-girlfriend accusing me of running away. My old boss mocking my decision to quit my job. Even my own voice, bitter and angry, asking why I was out here, chasing a dream that wasn't going anywhere. "You failed," the voice hissed. "You'll always fail." I stumbled back inside, slamming the door. The fog pressed against the windows, and I swore I saw something moving in it. A shadow, impossibly tall, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. That night, I barely slept. The fog surrounded the RV, blotting out everything. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the figure in the mist. It loomed over me, its eyes burning, its form shifting like smoke. When I woke, the whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up my gear, started the engine, and pulled onto the dirt road. But the fog wouldn't let me go. It thickened, reducing visibility to nothing, and no matter which way I turned, the road seemed to loop back to the same clearing. My GPS was useless, showing me as a blinking dot in the middle of nowhere. I parked, grabbed my camera, and headed out on foot. I needed answers. I needed to find the edge of the fog, or at least something that made sense. The forest led me to it, a crude altar deep in the woods. It was surrounded by weathered talismans, sticks bound with string and animal bones. The markings I'd seen on the trees were carved into the stones, spiraling inward toward a center where a blackened, rotting object sat. It looked like a heart. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the fog thickened around me. I turned, and there it was, the Watcher. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the mist. Its form was amorphous, shifting, as if the fog itself was alive and taking shape. Its eyes burned like embers, fixed on me, and I felt my knees go weak. It didn't move, but the weight of its presence was enough to crush the air from my lungs. I stumbled back, fumbling with my camera. The flash went off and the Watcher recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers turned to shrieks and the fog surged forward, forcing me to my knees. I had one chance. I grabbed a branch and lit it with the lighter I always kept in my pack. The flames danced, illuminating the altar, and I plunged the branch into the blackened heart. The fire caught, and the screams reached a deafening pitch. The Watcher surged toward me, its form expanding, and I thought it would consume me. But then it stopped. The fog began to dissipate, unraveling like thread. The Watcher faded, its eyes the last to disappear, and the forest fell silent. I stumbled back to the RV at dawn, my body trembling, my mind a haze. The fog was gone, but the memory of it lingered, pressing against my thoughts like a weight I couldn't shake. When I reviewed my camera footage later, the images of the watcher were distorted, the altar barely visible. It was as if the forest had erased itself. I left Olympic National Park that day, driving until the trees gave way to open highway, but even now, miles away, I can feel the watcher's gaze, its presence lingering just out of sight. I don't know if I'll ever go back to the forest, but I do know this. The fog isn't just mist. It's something more. Something that sees you, that knows you, and if you're not careful, it might never let you leave. Green Mountain National Forest was supposed to be a quiet escape. The blog I'd stumbled across spoke about an abandoned village deep in the woods, forgotten by time. Its cryptic history intrigued me. An old settlement wiped out by famine, the settlers disappearing without explanation. The writer of the blog claimed the site was haunted, but I wasn't here for ghost stories. I'd been drifting since the fire, driving my RV from state to state, trying to outrun memories that followed me like a shadow. This village was just another place to lose myself for a few days. The fog set in as soon as I turned off the highway, winding my RV along a gravel road that seemed to stretch endlessly. By the time I parked, the light was fading and the forest had grown unnervingly still. Stepping out of the RV, I inhaled the damp, mossy air. The ruins were a short walk away, tucked into the trees like a forgotten scar. My boots crunched over gravel as I made my way down a faint trail, the fog curling around me. The first structure I saw was the church. Its bell tower leaned precariously, the wooden frame weathered and splintered. Inside, broken pews lay scattered, half swallowed by the earth. I stood in the doorway, taking in the eerie silence. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint tolling, so soft it might have been the wind. Creepy, I muttered, stepping back onto the trail. The village spread out from the church like spokes on a wheel, its remnants barely recognizable. Stone foundations, rotting beams, and overgrown wells dotted the clearing. In the center stood a cracked fountain, its basin dry and choked with weeds. As I approached, a figure caught my eye. It stood at the edge of the ruins, half hidden by the fog, a man in tattered colonial-era clothing, his head bowed beneath the brim of a tricorn hat. "Hey," I called out, "you lost?" The man didn't move. I took a step forward, but when the fog shifted, he was gone. Back at the RV, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. It wasn't unusual to see reenactors or history buffs in places like this, but something about him didn't sit right. I busied myself with setting up camp, telling myself it didn't matter. Yet, as the night deepened, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no calls of distant animals. Just silence, so heavy it pressed against my ears. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like wind threading through the trees, but as the hours dragged on, they grew clearer. Urgent, pleading voices I couldn't understand. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were coming closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. The fog was thicker now, rolling in waves across the ground. I followed a set of faint footprints leading from my RV to the village square. That's when I saw him again. The tattered man stood by the fountain, his outline flickering like a dying flame. He raised a hand, pointing toward the forest's edge. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked into the fog. The next morning, I went back to the ruins, determined to find answers. I started with the church, its leaning bell tower casting long shadows over the clearing. Inside, I found remnants of an altar and a rusted cross nailed to the wall. Something glinted beneath the rubble, a journal, its cover cracked and moldy. I opened it carefully, the pages crumbling at the edges. The entries described the village's slow descent into despair during a brutal winter. Food supplies dwindled and sickness spread. The villagers turned to desperate measures, blaming each other for their misfortune. One name appeared repeatedly: the tattered man. "He walks in the fog," one entry read. "His whispers lead us astray. Beware his call." That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The tattered man appeared outside my RV, his figure distorted by the fog. His voice slipped into my mind like cold fingers, dragging memories I tried to bury to the surface. The fire, the smoke, my wife and daughter's screams as the flames devoured the house. "You could have saved them," he whispered, his voice a low, guttural growl. I clenched my fists, fighting back tears. "Leave me alone." But the whispers only grew louder, wrapping around me like a noose. The next day, I found the cellar. It was hidden beneath the ruins of what must have been a home, its entrance blocked by a rotting wooden door. I pried it open, descending into the damp, earthy darkness. The smell of decay hit me immediately, sharp and sour. Bones littered the floor, human remains tangled with rusted tools and scraps of cloth. At the center of the cellar was a crude altar, its surface stained dark with age. Another journal lay beside it, the writing even more frantic. "He waits for us. He is not of the living nor the dead. He feeds on our guilt." The words blurred as nausea churned in my stomach. I stumbled out of the cellar, gasping for air. That night, I made my stand. The tattered man came again, his form clearer now, tattered clothes hanging from a skeletal frame, his hollow eyes glowing faintly. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, stepping out of the RV. He pointed toward the bell tower, his whispers clawing at my mind. "You know why. They died because of you." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I tried to save them. Not hard enough." The weight of his words nearly brought me to my knees, but somewhere deep inside a spark of defiance flared. I wasn't going to let him win. Grabbing the journal and the artifacts I'd found, I marched to the bell tower. The tattered man followed, his presence growing colder and more oppressive with each step. At the base of the tower, I placed the journal and artifacts on the ground. "This ends here," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. The tattered man loomed over me, his form twisting and flickering like smoke. His whispers rose to a deafening pitch, the fog thickening until I could barely see. I grabbed a rusted rod from the ground and struck the bell. The sound was harsh, echoing through the forest like a thunderclap. The tattered man shrieked, his form breaking apart into fragments of light. The fog recoiled, swirling violently before dissolving into the night. When the silence returned, it felt different, lighter. I staggered back to the RV, exhausted but alive. As I drove away the next morning, the forest seemed to breathe again, its stillness no longer oppressive. In the distance, the bell tolled faintly, a reminder of the history I'd uncovered, and the man who would haunt the village no more. Green Mountain National Forest was supposed to be a quiet escape. The blog I'd stumbled across spoke about an abandoned village deep in the woods, forgotten by time. Its cryptic history intrigued me. An old settlement wiped out by famine, the settlers disappearing without explanation. The writer of the blog claimed the site was haunted, but I wasn't here for ghost stories. I'd been drifting since the fire, driving my RV from state to state, trying to outrun memories that followed me like a shadow. This village was just another place to lose myself for a few days. The fog set in as soon as I turned off the highway, winding my RV along a gravel road that seemed to stretch endlessly. By the time I parked, the light was fading, and the forest had grown unnervingly still. Stepping out of the RV, I inhaled the damp, mossy air. The ruins were a short walk away, tucked into the trees like a forgotten scar. My boots crunched over gravel as I made my way down a faint trail, the fog curling around me. The first structure I saw was the church. Its bell tower leaned precariously, the wooden frame weathered and splintered. Inside, broken pews lay scattered, half swallowed by the earth. I stood in the doorway, taking in the eerie silence. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint tolling, so soft it might have been the wind. Creepy, I muttered, stepping back onto the trail. The village spread out from the church like spokes on a wheel, its remnants barely recognizable. Stone foundations, rotting beams, and overgrown wells dotted the clearing. In the center stood a cracked fountain, its basin dry and choked with weeds. As I approached, a figure caught my eye. It stood at the edge of the ruins, half hidden by the fog. A man in tattered colonial-era clothing, his head bowed beneath the brim of a tricorn hat. "Hey," I called out. "You lost?" The man didn't move. I took a step forward, but when the fog shifted, he was gone. Back at the RV, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. It wasn't unusual to see reenactors or history buffs in places like this, but something about him didn't sit right. I busied myself with setting up camp, telling myself it didn't matter. Yet, as the night deepened, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no calls of distant animals. Just silence, so heavy it pressed against my ears. Then came the whispers, faint at first like wind threading through the trees, but as the hours dragged on, they grew clearer. Urgent, pleading voices I couldn't understand. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were coming closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. The fog was thicker now, rolling in waves across the ground. I followed a set of faint footprints leading from my RV to the village square. That's when I saw him again. The tattered man stood by the fountain, his outline flickering like a dying flame. He raised a hand, pointing towards the forest's edge. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked into the fog. The next morning, I went back to the ruins, determined to find answers. I started with the church, its leaning bell tower casting long shadows over the clearing. Inside, I found remnants of an altar and a rusted cross nailed to the wall. Something glinted beneath the rubble, a journal, its cover cracked and moldy. I opened it carefully, the pages crumbling at the edges. The entries described the village's slow descent into despair during a brutal winter. Food supplies dwindled and sickness spread. The villagers turned to desperate measures, blaming each other for their misfortune. One name appeared repeatedly: the tattered man. "He walks in the fog," one entry read. "His whispers lead us astray. Beware his call." That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The tattered man appeared outside my RV, his figure distorted by the fog. His voice slipped into my mind like cold fingers, dragging memories I tried to bury to the surface. The fire, the smoke, my wife and daughter's screams as the flames devoured the house. "You could have saved them," he whispered, his voice a low, guttural growl. I clenched my fists, fighting back tears. "Leave me alone." But the whispers only grew louder, wrapping around me like a noose. The next day, I found the cellar. It was hidden beneath the ruins of what must have been a home, its entrance blocked by a rotting wooden door. I pried it open, descending into the damp, earthy darkness. The smell of decay hit me immediately, sharp and sour. Bones littered the floor, human remains tangled with rusted tools and scraps of cloth. At the center of the cellar was a crude altar, its surface stained dark with age. Another journal lay beside it, the writing even more frantic. "He waits for us. He is not of the living nor the dead. He feeds on our guilt." The words blurred as nausea churned in my stomach. I stumbled out of the cellar, gasping for air. That night, I made my stand. The tattered man came again, his form clearer now, tattered clothes hanging from a skeletal frame, his hollow eyes glowing faintly. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, stepping out of the RV. He pointed toward the bell tower, his whispers clawing at my mind. "You know why. They died because of you." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I tried to save them." "Not hard enough." The weight of his words nearly brought me to my knees. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance flared. I wasn't going to let him win. Grabbing the journal and the artifacts I'd found, I marched to the bell tower. The tattered man followed, his presence growing colder and more oppressive with each step. At the base of the tower, I placed the journal and artifacts on the ground. "This ends here," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. The tattered man loomed over me, his form twisting and flickering like smoke. His whispers rose to a deafening pitch, the fog thickening until I could barely see. I grabbed a rusted rod from the ground and struck the bell. The sound was harsh, echoing through the forest like a thunderclap. The tattered man shrieked, his form breaking apart into fragments of light. The fog recoiled, swirling violently before dissolving into the night. When the silence returned, it felt different, lighter. I staggered back to the RV, exhausted but alive. As I drove away the next morning, the forest seemed to breathe again, its stillness no longer oppressive. In the distance, the bell tolled faintly, a reminder of the history I'd uncovered, and the man who would haunt the village no more. The Okefenokee swamp was quieter than I'd imagined. Not peaceful, there's a difference. Peaceful is birdsong and rustling leaves. This was something else, something unnatural. The silence pressed against my ears, broken only by the faint gurgle of unseen water and the occasional drip from a moss-draped cypress branch. When I parked my RV at the trailhead, the stillness wrapped around me like a heavy fog. There were no other vehicles, no signs of life. That was the point, of course. Solitude. A chance to forget the endless data sheets, sonar scans, and the claustrophobic labs where I'd spent the last decade as a marine biologist. But as I stepped out and stretched, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first day passed without incident. I paddled my kayak through narrow waterways that wound between towering cypress trees, their roots clawing into the dark water like skeletal fingers. The swamp was otherworldly, its tannic waters reflecting the sky so perfectly it felt like paddling through liquid glass. I took photos of the landscape, jotting down notes about the vegetation and wildlife, what little of it I saw. Even here, in the heart of nature, life seemed sparse, as though the swamp held its breath. That night, I sat by the RV, listening to the faint gurgle of the nearby water. My campfire flickered, casting shadows that danced across the trees. The silence was oppressive, but I told myself it was what I'd come for. A break, an escape. Then I heard it, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, like the vibration of a far-off engine. I paused, listening intently, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I shrugged it off and went to bed, falling into a restless sleep. The second day began with promise. I set off early, eager to explore a deeper section of the swamp I'd mapped out the night before. The air was heavy, the sun struggling to burn through a layer of mist. As I paddled, I noticed something strange. The water ahead of me was darker than the rest, almost inky black. It wasn't a trick of the light. The color didn't change even as the sun rose higher. My compass, clipped to the bow of the kayak, spun erratically, and my GPS refused to lock onto a signal. Magnetic interference, I muttered, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Then something brushed the underside of the kayak. I froze, gripping the paddle tightly. Alligators were common here, but this didn't feel like an animal. It was slower, deliberate, almost like a hand trailing along the bottom of the hull. My breath hitched as I peered into the black water, catching only faint, shifting shapes below. I paddled away, faster than I should have. That evening, the swamp began to show its true colors. As I prepared dinner outside the RV, I noticed my camera was missing. I distinctly remembered leaving it on the table, but now it was nowhere to be found. Frustrated, I searched the area, finally finding it a few feet from the water, half buried in mud. When I powered it on, the photos I'd taken earlier were corrupted, distorted images of swirling blackness and glowing orbs. A chill ran down my spine as I scrolled through them. I knew what I'd photographed, and this wasn't it. The hum returned that night, louder than before. It seemed to emanate from the swamp itself, a low vibration that rattled my nerves. Then came the lights. Dim at first, like fireflies they hovered over the water, bobbing gently, but as I watched they grew brighter, coalescing into floating orbs that moved with deliberate purpose. I grabbed my flashlight, wading toward the bank for a closer look. The lights flickered, retreating just out of reach. Then they blinked out entirely, leaving me alone in the dark. I couldn't sleep that night. The hum was inside my head, reverberating through my skull. I dreamed of the black water, of being pulled under by unseen hands, the pressure crushing my chest as shapes moved in the depths. When I woke, gasping for air, I found the door to the RV wide open. My notebook, where I'd been recording observations, was outside, its pages soaked and smeared with mud. I should have left. Every rational part of me screamed to pack up and go. But curiosity is a funny thing. It gnaws at you, refusing to let go. And in my line of work, curiosity was practically a survival instinct. I ventured deeper into the swamp the next day, following the blackwater. My paddle cut through the still surface, each stroke echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The air grew colder, the hum louder. That's when I found the canoe. It was old, half sunken, its frame rotten and splintered. Inside, beneath a pile of decaying leaves, was a journal. The leather cover was cracked and waterlogged, but the pages inside were legible. The entries were written in a frantic hand, detailing the author's descent into madness. They spoke of the lights, the hum, and a presence beneath the swamp, a force the author called the Deep One. "It knows I'm here," one entry read. "It wants me to see." The final page was smeared with mud, the words barely legible. "I can hear it calling. I'm afraid to look, but I cannot resist." I closed the journal, my hands shaking. That night, the swamp revealed itself. The lights returned, more numerous and brighter than before. They surrounded the RV, pulsing in time with the hum. I stepped outside, my heart pounding as the lights hovered closer. Then, from the black water, it rose. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinct against the inky surface, but as it emerged, its form became clear, amorphous and shifting, like a creature made of liquid darkness. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly, locking onto mine. My mind flooded with images, vast underwater caverns teeming with alien shapes, an endless abyss swallowing all light, and a presence, ancient and unknowable, pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed. The swamp wasn't just alive, it was sentient, and it was trying to show me something. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring into the black water. Time seemed to stretch, the hum consuming all thought. But as the presence grew stronger, a single, unshakable truth filled my mind. I didn't belong here. I staggered back to the RV, the lights parting as I moved. The entity didn't follow, but its presence lingered, heavy and unrelenting. By dawn, the swamp had returned to its unnatural stillness. The lights were gone, the hum faded, but I knew it wasn't over. The swamp had let me go, but it had left its mark. Driving away, I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes, the weight of the visions it had forced upon me. I don't write about what I saw. Some mysteries aren't meant to be understood. But every so often, I hear the hum in my dreams, a reminder of the deep silence that still watches from beneath the swamp. I arrived at Palo Duro Canyon State Park just as the sun dipped low, staining the cliffs a brilliant red. It was my first time in this part of Texas, and the endless expanse of desert meeting jagged rock felt both beautiful and desolate, perfect for a man who wanted to be alone. I parked my RV at a remote campsite near the canyon rim, the type of place the ranger at the gate had warned me about. "You'll be all by yourself out there," she said, her tone skeptical. "No other campers for miles." "That's the idea," I replied. Truthfully, I hadn't planned on coming here. My route was supposed to take me further south, but something about Palo Duro called to me. Maybe it was the need to escape the ghosts of my past, or maybe it was just morbid curiosity. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to be here. The first night was uneventful, though sleep came hard. I couldn't stop thinking about the fire. It's been years, but the memories still burned as bright as the day they happened. The heat, the smoke, the deafening roar as flames consumed everything around me. And the screams. God, the screams. I woke to the sound of hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. Sitting bolt upright in bed, I strained to hear. It was faint, but unmistakable, the rhythmic clatter of a horse moving along the rocky ground. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside into the cool night air. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. Nothing answered but the distant howl of a coyote. The hoofbeats had stopped. I shivered and went back inside, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. The next morning, I decided to hike the rim of the canyon. The sun was already blazing, and sweat clung to me as I navigated the dusty trail. Despite the heat, the landscape was stunning. Layers of red rock towered above me, while below, the canyon stretched endlessly, its depths veiled in shadow. About an hour in, I heard it again. Echoes. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my boots on the trail, bouncing back from the canyon walls, but then I heard something else, my own voice, faint and distorted. "You could have saved me," it said. I froze. The words hung in the air like smoke, curling around me. "Who's there?" I called, spinning in circles to scan the empty trail. The canyon swallowed my words, and silence returned. I pressed on, unsettled but determined not to let my mind play tricks on me. By late afternoon, I reached the far end of the trail, where the terrain grew steeper and less forgiving. That's when I saw it. A figure on horseback, standing motionless on a distant plateau. The rider was shrouded in shadow, their features obscured, but there was something wrong about them. The way they sat perfectly still, like a statue carved from the rock itself. I raised my hand to wave, but the rider didn't respond. Instead, they lifted one arm and pointed, straight at me. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was setting, casting the canyon in hues of orange and purple. My boots were coated in dust and my legs ached, but I couldn't stop thinking about the rider. Who were they? And why did they feel so unnatural? That night, I dreamed of fire. I was back in the burning building, the walls around me collapsing as flames licked the ceiling. My teammate, Jason, was trapped under a beam, his face twisted in terror. I tried to reach him, but the heat drove me back. "You could have saved me," he whispered, his voice echoing like it had on the trail. I woke, drenched in sweat, the smell of smoke still lingering in my nose. The third day, I found the hoof prints. They were scattered along the rim of the canyon, impossibly deep in the hard-packed dirt. The tracks led away from my campsite, down a narrow, unmarked trail that disappeared into the canyon below. I should have ignored them. I should have packed up and left, but something about the rider gnawed at me, pulling me toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted. The trail was treacherous, winding through jagged rocks and loose gravel. The deeper I went, the darker the canyon became, the towering walls blotting out the sun. It felt like descending into another world, one where the rules of light and sound no longer applied. That's when I found the abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold, surrounded by scattered belongings, a rusted lantern, a fraying backpack, and a journal. The tent had collapsed long ago, its fabric torn and bleached by the sun. I picked up the journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The entries inside were frantic, scrawled in a trembling hand. "The rider comes at night. I hear the hooves. I see the fire. I can't leave. The canyon won't let me. The final entry made my blood run cold. It's my fault. The rider knows. He knows I let them die. As I read, the handwriting began to shift. By the last page, it matched mine perfectly. I ran back to the RV, the journal clutched in my hands. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was someone messing with me? Or was it something more otherworldly? That night, the hoofbeats returned, louder than ever. The ground seemed to tremble with each step, the sound growing closer and closer. I stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rider was there, standing just beyond the firelight. Their form was clearer now, a towering figure cloaked in shadow, astride a skeletal horse whose eyes glowed like embers. The rider pointed at me, their voice a low, guttural growl. "You could have saved him." "I tried," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I tried to save him." The rider dismounted, their movements unnaturally smooth. They approached, each step sending a wave of cold through the air. I stumbled back, my legs trembling. "Face it," the rider said. "Face your guilt, or be claimed." I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. The rider's hollow eyes bored into mine, their presence crushing. But something inside me shifted, a spark of defiance, of acceptance. "I couldn't save him," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I tried, but I couldn't. And I've hated myself every day since." The rider stared at me for a long moment, then lowered their hand. The world seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting. The rider stepped back, fading into the shadows. When I woke the next morning, the campsite was untouched, as if nothing had happened. But the scorch marks on the canyon rim remained, a reminder of what I'd faced. I left Palo Duro Canyon that day, the journal still tucked in my bag. I don't know who or what the rider was, but I know they forced me to confront something I'd been running from for years. Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire. The Badlands have a way of making you feel small. Maybe it's the endless expanse of jagged ridges and dry ravines, or the way the wind cuts through the silence, carrying secrets older than memory. I came here to study the rocks, to lose myself in the layers of history carved into the earth. But by the time I left, I understood that some things buried in the past should stay there. It started the second day of my trip. I parked my RV near a remote section of the park, away from the designated campsites. The spot was perfect, quiet, desolate, the kind of place where no one would bother me. My plan was to spend a week surveying the formations, mapping them for a paper I'd been meaning to write. The land was a treasure trove of fossils, its eroded cliffs whispering stories of ancient seas and creatures long extinct. But as I hiked along the edge of a steep ravine, I noticed something unusual. A narrow fissure in the rock, almost hidden by a tumble of boulders. I pushed closer, feeling the thrill of discovery. The opening was just wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, the air was cool and still, a sharp contrast to the heat outside. My flashlight illuminated rough walls etched with strange symbols, circles, lines, and crude depictions of figures. At the far end of the cave was an altar-like slab of stone, and on it sat a small carved figurine. I hesitated. The figurine was strange, its features exaggerated, almost grotesque. Its surface was etched with the same symbols as the walls. I told myself I just wanted to study it, to document it properly. But as I picked it up, a weight settled over me, heavy and suffocating, like the cave itself was holding its breath. I should have left it there. That night, the wind howled outside the RV, rattling the windows like a warning. I sat at the small table, examining the figurine under the weak glow of my lantern. It was lighter than I'd expected, its surface worn smooth by time. But the longer I looked at it, the more unsettling it became. The figure's wide, hollow eyes seemed to follow me, its jagged grin twisting unnaturally. I set it down and turned to my notebook, trying to sketch its shape. That's when I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. Faint voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, swirled around me. I stood and peered out the window, but the darkness beyond revealed nothing. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The whispers stopped. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the cave, of the figurine staring at me with those hollow eyes, its grin stretching wider and wider. The next morning, I decided to shake off the unease. I chalked it up to nerves, too much time alone in the wilderness. I packed my gear and set out to survey a nearby ridge. The air was dry and sharp, the sun beating down mercilessly. By midday, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I set up my camera to photograph a particularly striking formation, I noticed something in the corner of the frame. A shadow, flickering at the edge of the ridge, just out of focus. I lowered the camera and scanned the area. Nothing. I tried again. The shadow was still there, darker this time, its shape almost human. My hands trembled as I adjusted the lens, but when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I packed up and hurried back to the RV. That night, the RV came alive. It started with the lights, flickering, dimming, then cutting out completely. I fiddled with the switches, cursing under my breath, but the bulbs refused to stay on. The air inside grew cold, colder than the desert night should have been. Then the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls, slipping through the cracks. My skin prickled as I turned in circles, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline. "Who's there?" I shouted. The RV rocked violently, as if something massive had slammed into its side. I stumbled, falling against the table. The figurine toppled onto the floor, landing at my feet. Its hollow eyes stared up at me, accusing. The RV shook again, and I bolted for the door. Outside, the night was eerily still. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. My breath came in short gasps as I scanned the darkness, half expecting the shadow to emerge from the trees. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I was unraveling. The figurine refused to leave me alone. I tried to pack it away, bury it in the bottom of my gear, but every time I turned around it was back in plain sight. On the table, on my cot, even in my hand once, though I didn't remember picking it up. The shadows grew bolder too. I saw them flickering at the edges of my vision, darting between the rocks, watching from the ridges. My camera caught glimpses of them, blurred and distorted, but they vanished as soon as I turned my head. That evening, I found the message. It was scrawled across the RV's window in a language I didn't recognize, the letters jagged and uneven. My pulse raced as I snapped a photo, hoping to translate it later. But deep down, I already knew what it meant. Return what you took. I set out for the cave the next morning, the figurine tucked under my arm. The hike felt longer this time, the landscape unfamiliar and hostile. The wind whipped at my face, carrying faint echoes of the whispers. The shadows followed me, closing in, their shapes twisting and merging like smoke. When I finally reached the cave, the air inside was colder than before, and the silence was absolute. I placed the figurine back on the altar, my hands trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground shifted. I stumbled back as a deep, guttural sound filled the cave, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The shadows coalesced at the edges of the chamber, forming shapes that loomed over me, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. My chest tightened as a wave of images flooded my mind. Ancient rituals, battles, mourning processions. The weight of countless generations pressed down on me, their voices a cacophony of rage and sorrow. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean to." The shadows surged forward, and I blacked out. I woke outside the cave, the sun low on the horizon. My body ached, and a strange burning pain seared my left arm. When I rolled up my sleeve, I saw it. A mark, etched into my skin like a brand. The same symbols that covered the cave walls. A warning. The RV was just as I'd left it, but the unease lingered. As I drove away, the landscape seemed brighter, less oppressive. But the weight in my chest remained. I knew I'd escaped something ancient and terrible, but it had left its mark on me, a reminder of what I'd disturbed. As I reached the edge of the park, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow standing at the mouth of the cave, watching. I didn't look back. I was halfway up Skyline Drive when I saw him. The hitchhiker stood on the shoulder, his thumb out and his grin wide, as if he already knew I'd stop. His clothes were old, like something out of a black and white photo, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Against my better judgment, I slowed the RV and rolled down the window. "You need a ride?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, just tilted his head like he was studying me. Then that grin of his grew wider. "Sure do. Just to the next trailhead, if it's no trouble." His voice was smooth, almost musical. I hesitated, but there wasn't anyone else around, and the thought of leaving him out here alone didn't sit right. I nodded toward the passenger seat. "Hop in." The first thing I noticed was the smell. A faint, sour odor like damp clothes left to mildew. He didn't seem to notice as he settled into the seat, his grin never faltering. "Thanks," he said. "Not many people stop these days." "No problem," I replied, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Where are you headed?" He pointed up the road. "The trailhead near the bend. You'll see it." We drove in silence for a while, the tires humming against the asphalt. I kept stealing glances at him, but he didn't move, didn't blink, just stared straight ahead with that unsettling smile plastered on his face. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. "So, you hiking alone?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Something like that," he said, his tone light but vague. "I like the quiet out here. It's good for thinking." I nodded, though I couldn't imagine what he had to think about. His grin made it impossible to read his mood. Was he friendly? Nervous? Dangerous? I couldn't tell. We reached the trailhead sooner than I expected. He turned to me, his grin somehow wider now, "Thanks for the lift, Nathan." My stomach dropped. I hadn't told him my name. I watched him disappear into the trees, his lanky frame swallowed by the forest. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, replaying his words in my head. How had he known who I was? I wanted to convince myself I'd imagined it, but something about his voice stuck with me, like a song you can't shake. Back at the campsite, I tried to focus on my riding. The memoir wasn't coming together, though I wasn't surprised. The whole trip was supposed to be a fresh start, but the weight of my past was a constant presence. My career had gone up in flames after the article, after the death. I hadn't written anything real since. The forest was supposed to be my escape, but instead, it felt like the walls were closing in. That night, I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps against the RV door echoing through the stillness. I froze, my pen hovering over the notebook. The knock came again. I peeked through the curtain, and there he was, the hitchhiker. His grin was impossibly wide now, stretching across his face like it didn't belong there. My breath hitched as he raised a hand and knocked again. "Open up, Nathan," he said, his voice muffled but clear. "I just want to talk." I didn't move. I couldn't. I backed away from the door, heart pounding, and grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a rusted camping hatchet. The knocking stopped. When I looked again, he was gone. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a bad dream. Stress, maybe, or too much whiskey. But when I stepped outside, I saw the footprints. Bare, muddy tracks circled the RV, leading from the door to the edge of the woods. I followed them a few steps before stopping. The prints didn't fade or disappear. They just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I hiked to a nearby overlook, snapping photos of the valley below, but my mind kept drifting back to that grin. By the time I returned, the sun was setting, and the forest felt darker than it should have. Inside the RV, I found something that shouldn't have been there. A newspaper clipping lying on the table. My stomach churned as I picked it up. It was from 3 years ago, the headline bold and damning. "Investigative journalist story leads to fatal overdose." It was my story. The one that ruined everything. The forest changed after that. Paths that had been familiar now looped back on themselves, and landmarks disappeared when I tried to retrace my steps. The trees seemed taller, their branches tangled and gnarled like claws. At night, the forest came alive with sounds, branches snapping, footsteps circling the RV, whispers that sounded like my own voice. And then there was the grin. I saw it in reflections, the RV's windows, the mirror above the sink, even the surface of my coffee mug. My own face, distorted by that same crooked, unnatural smile. Each time, it lingered a little longer, taunting me. On the 3rd night, he came inside. I woke to the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, crossing the RV floor. My heart raced as I reached for the hatchet, clutching it tightly. The footsteps stopped, and I felt the air grow heavy, the temperature dropping until my breath came out in visible puffs. "Morning, Nathan," he said. I turned, and there he was, sitting in the passenger seat like nothing was wrong. His grin was impossibly wide now, stretching far past the corners of his mouth. His eyes glinted in the dim light, dark and empty. "How did you—" I stammered. "Does it matter?" he interrupted. "You've been running a long time, Nathan. Isn't it time to stop?" I tightened my grip on the hatchet. What do you want?" He leaned forward, his grin never faltering. "I want what you've got, that guilt, that pain. It's heavy, isn't it? Let me take it off your hands." I shook my head, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You're not real." "Oh, I'm as real as you need me to be," he said, his voice almost playful. "The question is, how long are you going to keep carrying that weight?" I didn't sleep after he disappeared again. I sat at the table, staring at the clipping, replaying his words over and over in my head. The article, the death, the fallout, it all came flooding back. I'd written the piece knowing it would ruin lives, but I'd never imagined it would end one. The man I exposed had begged me to retract it, to reconsider. I hadn't listened. And he'd died for it. By dawn, I made a decision. I was getting out. I packed my things and started the RV, but it wouldn't move. The engine roared, but the wheels refused to grip the dirt. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw the hitchhiker again, standing at the edge of the woods. "Leaving so soon?" he called, his grin split in his face. "You can't go yet, not until we finish this." I ran at him, hatchet in hand, but he didn't move. The closer I got, the harder it was to breathe, as if the air itself was pressing against me. By the time I reached him, my vision was swimming, and I collapsed to my knees. "You can't outrun it, Nathan," he said, crouching beside me. "The guilt, the shame, it's part of you, but there's a way out." "What do you want from me?" I gasped. His grin widened, if that was even possible. "A trade. You leave your pain with me, and I leave mine with you. It's fair, isn't it?" I don't know how long I knelt there, staring at that impossibly wide grin. Part of me wanted to say yes, to let it go, but another part of me knew it wouldn't work. The pain was mine. I had earned it, and I couldn't just hand it off to someone else. "No," I said finally, my voice shaking. "I'm not giving it to you." The hitchhiker's grin faltered for the first time. His face twisted, something dark and angry bubbling beneath the surface. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He stood, brushing off his tattered clothes, and stepped back toward the trees. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone light but cold. "But I'll be here when you change your mind." And then he was gone. When I finally got the RV moving, the forest seemed brighter, the paths clearer. I drove until I reached the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel. The hitchhiker didn't appear again, but I could still feel him, watching, waiting. I don't know what he was or why he chose me, but I know one thing. I'll carry the weight of my guilt for the rest of my life. It's mine to bear, and that's how it should be. The last time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw him standing by the roadside, his grin wide and unbroken. I didn't stop. I'd always thought the desert was supposed to be silent, a place where you could hear your own breath, the crunch of sand beneath your boots, the whisper of the wind against the scrub. That's why I came here, to escape the noise of the world. But instead of silence, I found the signal. It was faint at first. I'd set up my equipment outside the RV, the metal antenna gleaming under the burning Mojave sun. I'd been scanning frequencies for hours, sweating in the oppressive heat when I caught it. A strange, rhythmic broadcast. A female voice reciting numbers in a monotone, interrupted by bursts of static and a sharp, almost musical tone. 3, 6, 8, 2, 7. Static. A tone. Then it started over again. I sat up straighter in my folding chair, adjusting the dials. It didn't match anything I'd encountered before, not a number station, not a distress call. My heart raced as I scribbled down the sequence, my pen trembling in my hand. This was something special, something worth chasing. By nightfall, the signal had me hooked. I was crouched inside the RV, surrounded by cables and blinking lights, trying to triangulate its location. But every calculation came up blank. The broadcast was moving, jumping across coordinates like it was playing a game. The numbers never changed, but their origin shifted, impossible to pin down. Frustrated, I stepped outside to clear my head. The desert stretched endlessly around me, vast and empty, bathed in silver moonlight. The air was cool now, a welcome relief after the day's heat. I stared at the stars, hoping to shake off the unease that had been building since I first heard the signal. Then I saw them. Faint lights in the sky, hovering low over the horizon. At first, I thought they were planes, but they didn't move like planes. They pulsed softly, almost in time with the broadcast I'd recorded earlier. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the lights. They weren't stars. They weren't satellites. They were something else. Something wrong. I didn't sleep that night. The signal kept playing in my head, looping over and over until I couldn't tell if I was hearing it or imagining it. I lay on the narrow cot in the RV, staring at the ceiling while the desert pressed in around me. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard a noise, a soft tapping against the window. My breath caught, and I froze. It came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding, and reached for the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but the scrub outside. I stepped out onto the sand, my boots crunching softly, and swept the flashlight across the horizon. Nothing moved, but the air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. Then I noticed the lights again. Closer now, their glow faint but undeniable. They hung in the air, pulsing gently like they were watching me. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The desert swallowed the sound. The next morning, I found my equipment in ruins. The radio I'd left on the table was now outside, and its casing cracked, wires spilling out like entrails. My laptop was frozen, its screen displaying a line of nonsense characters that scrolled endlessly. Even my notebook, where I'd recorded the signal sequence, had been torn from its binding and scattered across the sand. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe a coyote had nosed its way into the RV, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Determined, I spent the day repairing what I could. The sun was relentless, beating down on me as I soldered wires and adjusted connections. Every so often, I glanced toward the horizon, half expecting to see the lights again, but the sky remained empty, mocking me with its clarity. By the time the sun dipped below the dunes, I was exhausted but ready. I powered up the radio, fingers hovering over the dials, and scanned the frequencies. It came back. Stronger this time. 3, 6, 8, 2, 7. Static, a tone, then a new voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakably speaking directly to me. "You're close." I froze. My hands shook as I reached for the volume knob. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The only response was static. The lights returned that night. I saw them from the window of the RV, hovering just beyond the scrub. They were brighter now, pulsing in a way that felt deliberate, like a heartbeat. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside. The cool desert air hit my skin, but it did nothing to calm the fire of panic in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the lights, but they didn't react. They just hung there, waiting. "Is this you?" I shouted into the dark. "Are you sending the signal?" The lights shifted, moving closer. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose cable and landing hard on the sand. The flashlight flew from my hand, rolling a few feet away. By the time I grabbed it, the lights were gone. But something else was there. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, circling the RV. I spun the flashlight in every direction, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The beam caught nothing but empty desert. When I finally retreated inside and locked the door, the footsteps stopped. But I could still feel them, whatever they were, watching. By the third day, I was unraveling. The signal grew louder, bleeding into every piece of equipment I had. The numbers looped endlessly, now joined by a whispering voice that sent shivers down my spine. "Come closer," it said, over and over, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I tried to drive away that afternoon, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, coughing weakly before falling silent. I checked the fuel gauge, full. I checked the battery, charged. But no matter what I did, the RV wouldn't move. Frustrated, I grabbed a map and set out on foot, hoping to find a main road or at least a cell signal. But the desert seemed to shift around me, erasing landmarks I'd passed on the way in. Every turn brought me back to the same spot. The RV, sitting silent and still beneath the unforgiving sun. That night, I saw it. I was sitting at the table, staring blankly at the notebook I'd managed to piece back together when the lights appeared outside. Brighter now, so close I could see the ground beneath them illuminated in their glow. And in the center of the lights was a figure. It was tall and thin, its outline shimmering like a heat mirage. In its hand, it held something, a lantern, glowing with the same pulsing light as the orbs above. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at the RV. I don't know what possessed me to open the door. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was both. The figure turned and began to walk, its lantern swinging gently at its side. The lights followed, bobbing in rhythm, and I, against every instinct screaming at me to stop, followed too. The desert felt alive around me, the sand shifting under my feet like it was trying to pull me down. The figure moved ahead, always just out of reach, its lantern casting strange, twisting shadows across the dunes. The lights above pulsed in time with my racing heartbeat. I don't know how far I walked, but when the figure finally stopped, I realized I was standing at the edge of a sinkhole. The ground here was soft, crumbling beneath my boots. The figure turned to face me, its lantern held high, and for the first time I saw its face, or what was left of it. Hollow eyes, a mouth that stretched too wide like it was caught mid-scream. Its skin shimmered like static, flickering in and out of focus. And then it spoke. Closer. I took a step back, my foot slipping on the loose sand. The figure reached out a hand, and the ground beneath me gave way. I woke at dawn, lying in the sand a few feet from the RV. The lights were gone. The figure was gone. The signal was gone. I dragged myself inside, my limbs heavy with exhaustion, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life on the first try. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the lights again, faint and distant, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Somewhere in the static, I think I still hear the numbers